The rain hammered against the windows of Robert Mitchell's modest two-bedroom apartment in Buffalo, New York, creating a rhythmic percussion that had kept him awake for the better part of the night. At 63, Robert had grown accustomed to sleepless nights, though they weren't always caused by weather. Tonight, the insomnia felt different, heavier, as if the October storm outside was somehow connected to the restlessness churning in his chest. Robert sat in his worn leather recliner, the same one he'd bought when Margaret was still alive, when their small apartment felt full of life rather than echoes. The television flickered with late-night programming, but the volume was turned down low enough that only the occasional commercial jingle broke through the sound of rain. His reading glasses hung from a chain around his neck, and a half-finished crossword puzzle lay abandoned on the side table next to a cold cup of coffee. The digital clock on the cable box read 11:47 p.m. when Robert's eyes finally began to feel heavy. He was just reaching for the remote to turn off the television when the phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the apartment like a knife. Robert's heart jumped. Phone calls after 11 p.m. were never good news, not at his age. His first thought went to his daughter Sarah in Seattle or his younger brother Tom in Florida. He fumbled for his glasses and pushed himself out of the recliner with a grunt, his arthritic knees protesting the sudden movement. The cordless phone sat on the kitchen counter, its red light blinking insistently. Robert's hand trembled slightly as he picked it up, a combination of age and sudden anxiety. "Hello?" His voice came out raspier than he expected. Static filled the line for a moment, the kind of interference that reminded Robert of long-distance calls from decades past. Then, clear as if the person was standing in the same room, came a voice that stopped Robert's heart cold. "Bobby? Bobby, is that you?" The phone nearly slipped from Robert's fingers. The voice was unmistakable. The slight Brooklyn accent, the particular way of saying his childhood nickname, the warm tone that had comforted him through scraped knees and broken dreams. It was his father's voice, exactly as he remembered it from 39 years ago. Who is this?" Robert managed to whisper, though deep in his bones he already knew the impossible answer. "It's Dad, Bobby. I know this must be confusing, but I need to talk to you. I need to tell you something important." Robert's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto one of the kitchen chairs. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible. Frank Mitchell had died of a heart attack in 1984, at age 57. Robert had been there, had held his father's hand in the hospital room as the machines fell silent. He had spoken at the funeral, had carried the coffin, had visited the grave every Father's Day for nearly 4 decades, but the voice on the phone was undeniably his father's. "This isn't possible," Robert said, his voice barely audible. "Dad's been dead for 39 years. A soft chuckle came through the receiver, and Robert's heart clenched with recognition. It was the same gentle laugh his father had used when Robert, as a boy, had asked difficult questions about life and death. "I know how this sounds, son. I know it doesn't make sense. But I need you to listen to me, really listen. There are things I never got to say, things I should have told you before I left." Robert's hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the phone. Part of him wanted to hang up, to dismiss this as some cruel prank or a stress-induced hallucination. But the voice was too perfect, too exact in its inflections and mannerisms. Even if someone were skilled enough to imitate his father's voice, how could they know to call him Bobby? Only his father had ever used that name consistently. "Where are you calling from?" Robert asked, surprised by his own question. The journalist in him, dormant since his retirement from the Buffalo News 5 years earlier, was awakening. "That's not important right now, Bobby. What matters is that I can see you're struggling. You've been struggling for a long time, haven't you, since Margaret passed?" The mention of his wife's name sent a chill down Robert's spine. Margaret had died 3 years ago from cancer, and her loss had left Robert adrift in a way he'd never experienced. They'd been married for 38 years, and without her steady presence, Robert had felt increasingly isolated and purposeless. "How do you know about Margaret?" Robert's voice was stronger now, tinged with a mix of fear and anger. "I know a lot of things, son. I know you blame yourself for not catching her illness sooner. I know you spend most of your days alone in that apartment, afraid to reach out to Sarah because you don't want to be a burden. I know you haven't been taking care of yourself the way you should." Each word hit Robert like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were absolutely true. In the 3 years since Margaret's death, Robert had indeed become a shadow of himself. He'd gained weight, stopped exercising, and had withdrawn from the few friendships he'd maintained into retirement. His daughter Sarah called regularly, but Robert always assured her he was fine, not wanting to worry her or complicate her life in Seattle with her own family. "I don't understand what's happening," Robert said, his voice breaking slightly. "You don't have to understand it, Bobby. You just have to listen. I'm calling because you're at a crossroads, son. You can keep living the way you have been, isolated, afraid, letting grief consume what years you have left, or you can choose something different." The line crackled with static for a moment, and Robert found himself leaning forward, straining to hear every word. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean it's time for you to start living again, really living. Margaret wouldn't want you to waste away in that apartment, and you know it. She'd want you to find purpose again, to connect with people, to matter in the world." Robert felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. These were thoughts that had been lurking in the back of his mind for months, accusations he'd leveled at himself in his darkest moments. But hearing them spoken in his father's voice gave them a weight he couldn't ignore. "I don't know how," he admitted. "I don't know how to start over at 63. You start by taking the first step, son. Tomorrow, you're going to receive an opportunity. Someone's going to reach out to you, offer you a chance to use your skills again, to make a difference. I need you to say yes." "What kind of opportunity?" But the line had gone quiet except for the persistent static. Robert waited, holding his breath, but his father's voice didn't return. "Dad? Dad, are you there?" The dial tone filled the kitchen, harsh and final. Robert stared at the phone for a long moment before setting it back in its cradle with trembling hands. He looked around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time, the unwashed dishes in the sink, the pile of unopened mail on the counter, the calendar that still showed August, even though it was mid-October. The apartment felt different now, charged with an energy that hadn't been there an hour before. Robert walked slowly back to the living room, his mind reeling. Every rational thought told him that what had just happened was impossible. Dead people don't make phone calls. Grief and loneliness could play tricks on the mind. There had to be a logical explanation, but as he settled back into his recliner, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The voice had been too real, too perfectly his father's, with details that no stranger could have known. And more importantly, the message resonated with a truth that Robert had been avoiding for 3 years. He was indeed at a crossroads. He could continue his slow slide into isolation and irrelevance, or he could find the courage to engage with life again. The question was whether he had the strength to choose the more difficult path. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but it no longer sounded ominous. Instead, it seemed to carry a kind of cleansing quality, as if the storm were washing away the stagnation that had settled over Robert's life like dust. He reached for the remote and turned off the television, plunging the apartment into a darkness broken only by the streetlights filtering through the rain-streaked windows. For the first time in months, Robert felt genuinely tired in a way that suggested actual sleep might be possible. As he made his way to the bedroom, Robert found himself thinking about his father, not as the voice on the phone, but as the man he'd been in life. Frank Mitchell had been a blue-collar worker, a mechanic who'd built a small but successful auto repair shop in their old neighborhood in Brooklyn. He'd been practical, hard-working, and devoted to his family, but most importantly, he'd been a man who faced challenges head-on, who believed that action was always better than paralysis. "Someone's going to reach out to you," the voice had said. "I need you to say yes." As Robert climbed into bed for the first time feeling hopeful rather than resigned, he made a mental commitment. Whatever opportunity presented itself tomorrow, he would at least consider it. He owed that much to his father's memory, and to the part of himself that still wanted to matter in the world. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, but now it sounded like applause. Robert woke the next morning feeling more rested than he had in months, despite the extraordinary events of the previous night. Sunlight streamed through his bedroom windows, casting away the shadows that had seemed so ominous during the storm. As consciousness fully returned, he began to question whether the midnight phone call had really happened, or if it had been an unusually vivid dream brought on by stress and loneliness. He padded to the kitchen in his slippers and robe, noting that the cordless phone sat innocently in its cradle, giving no sign of the impossible conversation it may or may not have facilitated. Robert started his usual morning routine: coffee, toast, a glance at the Buffalo news that was delivered to his door each day. But even as he tried to normalize the morning, he found himself listening for the phone with an anticipation he couldn't quite explain. The call came at 9:23 a.m. Robert Mitchell. The voice was crisp, professional, and decidedly female, nothing like the impossible voice from the night before. "Speaking," Robert replied, his heart rate quickening despite himself. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Linda Peterson. I'm the executive director of the Harbor Light Community Center here in Buffalo. I got your name from the personnel files at the Buffalo News. I hope you don't mind my calling out of the blue like this." Robert nearly dropped his coffee mug. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. Less than 12 hours after his father's voice had promised an opportunity, here it was. "Not at all," he managed. "How can I help you?" "Well, we're launching a new program here at the center, and we're looking for someone with your background and experience. I understand you spent over 30 years as an investigative journalist." "That's right. I retired about 5 years ago." Robert found himself sitting straighter in his chair, his professional instincts awakening for the first time in years. "We're starting something we're calling the Community Voice Project. Essentially, we want to document the stories of elderly residents in Buffalo who might otherwise be forgotten, their experiences, their contributions to the city, their memories of how the community has changed over the decades. We need someone who knows how to conduct interviews, how to draw out stories, and how to write them up in a compelling way." Robert felt a spark of interest that surprised him with its intensity. "That sounds like meaningful work." "It is. These are people with incredible stories, Mr. Mitchell. World War II veterans, civil rights activists, business owners who helped shape the city, immigrants who built new lives here. But many of them are isolated now, their stories at risk of being lost forever. We want to preserve those narratives and share them with the broader community." The parallel to his own situation wasn't lost on Robert. He too was an elderly resident with stories to tell, increasingly isolated and at risk of being forgotten. "The position would be part-time," Linda continued, "about 20 hours a week, with flexible scheduling. We can't offer much in terms of compensation. It's mainly a volunteer position with a small stipend to cover expenses. But I have a feeling the real reward would be in the work itself." Robert found himself thinking about the previous night's conversation, about his father's voice, urging him to say yes to whatever opportunity presented itself. The rational part of his mind still questioned whether that call had been real, but the message was sound, regardless of its source. "I'd like to know more," he heard himself saying. "Wonderful. Would you be available to come in later today? I'd love to show you around the center and introduce you to some of the people you'd be working with." They arranged to meet at 2 p.m., and after hanging up, Robert sat in his kitchen feeling more energized than he had in years. For the first time since Margaret's death, he had somewhere to be, someone who needed his skills, a purpose beyond simply getting through each day. He spent the morning preparing for the meeting with a thoroughness that reminded him of his younger self. He showered and shaved carefully, selected his best casual clothes, and even polished his shoes. As he dressed, Robert caught sight of himself in the bedroom mirror and was shocked by what he saw. When had he become so old? His hair, once thick and dark like his father's, was now completely grey and thinning on top. His face was deeply lined, and he'd gained at least 30 pounds since Margaret's death, but more than the physical changes, it was his posture and expression that startled him. He looked defeated, worn down by grief and isolation. "You can't go on like this," he said to his reflection, hearing an echo of his father's voice in his own words. The Harbour Light Community Center was located in Buffalo's East Side, in a building that had once been an elementary school. The brick facade showed its age, but the grounds were well maintained, and colourful banners hung from the entrance announcing various programs and events. As Robert walked through the front doors, he was immediately struck by the energy of the place. The lobby buzzed with activity. Elderly residents sat in clusters, playing cards and chatting. A group was gathered around a piano where a volunteer led them in singing songs from the 1940s. Children from an after-school program ran through the hallways, their laughter echoing off the institutional walls, but somehow making them feel warm rather than sterile. Linda Peterson turned out to be a woman in her early 50s, with short grey hair and the kind of warm, direct manner that immediately put Robert at ease. She was clearly someone who had dedicated her life to service, and her passion for the community centre was evident in every word she spoke. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you so much for coming," she said, gripping his hand firmly. "I can't tell you how excited I was when I found your name in our research. Your articles on city government corruption in the 1990s were incredible journalism." Robert felt a flush of pride he hadn't experienced in years. I'd forgotten anyone still remembered those pieces. "Are you kidding? That series you wrote about the Housing Authority scandal probably prevented millions in taxpayer dollars from being wasted." "That's exactly the kind of investigative instinct we need for this project." As Linda led him through the center, introducing him to staff members and residents, Robert began to see the scope of what they were proposing. The Community Voice Project wasn't just about collecting stories. It was about creating a living archive of Buffalo's recent history as told by the people who had lived it. They stopped in what had once been the school's library, now converted into a comfortable space with recording equipment and several cozy seating areas designed for intimate conversations. "This is where most of the interviews would take place," Linda explained. "We've already identified about 30 residents who are eager to share their stories. Some of them have never talked in detail about their experiences, even to their own families." She introduced Robert to Agnes Kowalski, an 87-year-old Polish immigrant who had arrived in Buffalo as a teenager after World War II. Agnes's eyes lit up when Linda explained Robert's potential role in the project. "Oh, you want to hear old ladies' stories?" Agnes asked with a slight accent still evident after more than 70 years in America. "I could tell you things that would make your hair curl. The things we survived, the way this city was back then." "I see." Robert found himself leaning forward, his reporter's instincts fully engaged. "What was it like when you first arrived? What were your first impressions of Buffalo?" For the next 20 minutes, Agnes shared stories of post-war Buffalo that Robert had never heard, despite his decades of covering the city. She talked about the tight-knit immigrant communities, the industrial boom that drew families from across Europe, and the challenges of preserving cultural identity while embracing American opportunities. As Agnes spoke, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of discovery that had made him love journalism in the first place. Every good story was really about human connections, about understanding how individual experiences reflected larger truths about society and history. "Mr. Mitchell," Linda said as they wrapped up the informal interview, "I can see that you understand what we're trying to accomplish here." Robert nodded, feeling more certain than he had about anything in recent memory. "When would you need an answer about the position?" "Well, ideally we'd love to start next week if you're interested. But I don't want to pressure you. This is a big commitment, and I imagine you have other things going on in your life." The irony of that statement almost made Robert laugh. Other things going on. His biggest commitment was usually deciding which television shows to watch each day. "Actually," he said, "I think I can give you an answer right now. I'd like to accept the position." Linda's face broke into a broad smile. "Really? That's wonderful. Are you sure you don't need to think it over? Talk to your family?" "I'm sure," Robert said, and realized he truly was. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt like he was moving towards something rather than simply drifting away from everything he'd lost. As they discussed logistics and scheduling, Robert found himself thinking again about the previous night's phone call. Whether it had been real or imagined, the message had been clear. It was time to start living again, and this opportunity felt like the perfect way to begin. The drive home took Robert through several neighborhoods he hadn't visited in years. Buffalo had changed dramatically during his lifetime, with some areas declining while others experienced renaissance. As he drove, he found himself seeing the city through new eyes, imagining the stories that might be hidden in its streets and buildings. Back in his apartment that evening, Robert called his daughter Sarah in Seattle. It was the first time in months that he had initiated the call rather than simply responding to her regular check-ins. "Dad!" "This is a surprise," Sarah said, and Robert could hear both pleasure and concern in her voice. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, honey. Actually, better than fine. I have some news." As he told Sarah about the opportunity at the community center, Robert heard something in his own voice that had been missing for years: enthusiasm. Sarah seemed to hear it too. "Dad, this sounds perfect for you," she said. "I've been so worried. You've seemed so isolated since Mom died. This could be exactly what you need." "I think you're right," Robert said. "I'm actually excited about something for the first time in a long while." After they hung up, Robert sat in his living room thinking about beginnings. At 63, he'd assumed that the important chapters of his life were behind him. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe there were still stories to be discovered, connections to be made, purposes to be served. He looked at the phone that may or may not have carried his father's voice the night before. Whether the call had been real or a product of his subconscious mind, it had served its purpose. Robert was ready to say yes to life again. Tomorrow he would begin collecting the stories of others. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt like his own story was just beginning a new chapter. 3 weeks into his work at the Harbor Light Community Center, Robert had already conducted interviews with 8 residents, and each conversation had revealed layers of Buffalo's history he'd never encountered in his years as a newspaper reporter. The formal structure of journalism had rarely allowed for the kind of deep, personal storytelling that emerged in the comfortable setting of the center's interview room. This morning, he was scheduled to meet with Calvin Washington, a 79-year-old man who had been one of the first African-American police officers hired by the Buffalo Police Department in the late 1960s. Linda had warned Robert that Calvin was sometimes reluctant to discuss his experiences, having faced discrimination that had left lasting scars. Robert arrived early, as had become his habit, to review his notes and prepare the recording equipment. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the former library, casting warm light on the comfortable chairs where he conducted his interviews. He'd grown to love this space and the ritual of preparation it afforded him. Calvin arrived precisely on time, a tall, dignified man whose bearing still suggested the authority he'd once carried as a police officer. He moved carefully, favoring his left leg, and Robert noticed the slight tremor in his hands that suggested Parkinson's disease. "Mr. Washington, thank you for agreeing to share your story," Robert said as they settled into their chairs. "I understand you joined the Buffalo Police Department in 1968? Calvin nodded slowly. 1968. "I was 24 years old, married, had a baby daughter. It was either the police force or the steel plant, and I thought law enforcement might offer more opportunities for advancement." He paused, a slight smile crossing his face. "I was young and optimistic." Over the next hour, Calvin shared stories that painted a vivid picture of Buffalo during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. He talked about being one of only 3 black officers in a department of more than 800, about the subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination he'd faced from colleagues and supervisors, and about his determination to prove himself worthy of the badge. "The thing people don't understand," Calvin said, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his subject, "is that I wasn't just representing myself out there. Every arrest I made, every report I wrote, every interaction with the public, I was representing every black person who might want to follow in my footsteps." Robert found himself completely absorbed in Calvin's narrative. The man's experiences paralleled the broader civil rights movement, but from a unique perspective, that of someone working within a system while trying to change it from the inside. "Tell me about the riots in 1967, Robert said, referring to the civil unrest that had shaken Buffalo's east side the summer before Calvin joined the force. Calvin's expression grew serious. "I wasn't on the force yet, but I was living in the neighborhood where most of the trouble happened. I saw how the police response escalated tensions instead of calming them. That's part of why I wanted to become an officer. I thought maybe I could help bridge that gap between the community and law enforcement." "Were you able to do that?" "Sometimes," Calvin said after a long pause. "There were situations where being a black officer made a difference, where I could connect with people in ways my white colleagues couldn't, but it also put me in an impossible position sometimes. The community didn't always trust me because I wore the uniform, and some of my fellow officers didn't trust me because of my skin color." As Calvin continued his story, Robert began to see patterns that connected to his other interviews. Agnes Kowalski had talked about the challenges of maintaining cultural identity while assimilating into American society. Mary Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had opened one of Buffalo's first authentic Chinese restaurants, had described similar struggles with acceptance and belonging. Each story was unique, but they all spoke to the universal human experience of trying to find one's place in a changing world. "Mr. Washington," Robert said as they neared the end of their scheduled time, "what would you want young people today to understand about that period in Buffalo's history?" Calvin was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "I'd want them to understand that change is possible, but it's slow, and it requires people to be willing to put themselves in uncomfortable situations. I spent 31 years on that police force, and by the time I retired, things were different. Not perfect, but different. I like to think I played a small part in that change." After Calvin left, Robert sat alone in the interview room, reflecting on the morning's conversation. Each of these interviews was adding depth to his understanding of Buffalo's recent history, but they were also changing his perspective on his own life and experiences. He thought about his father's generation, about the challenges they had faced during the Depression and World War II. Frank Mitchell had rarely talked in detail about his experiences during the war, and Robert now regretted not asking more questions when he had the chance. How many important stories were lost simply because no one had taken the time to ask the right questions? That afternoon, Robert worked on transcribing Calvin's interview, a process that had become meditative for him. As he listened to the recording and typed out the conversation, he often discovered nuances and details he'd missed during the actual interview. Today, he was particularly struck by something Calvin had said about the importance of documenting these experiences. "History gets written by whoever bothers to write it down," Calvin had observed. "If we don't tell our own stories, somebody else will tell them for us, and they might not get them right." The comment resonated with Robert's own experience as a journalist. Throughout his career, he'd seen how important stories could be overlooked or misrepresented simply because the right person wasn't there to ask the right questions at the right time. As he worked, Robert's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID, expecting to see Linda Peterson's name or perhaps his daughter calling from Seattle. Instead, the display showed only "unknown number." Robert hesitated for a moment, remembering the strange call 3 weeks earlier, but curiosity overcame caution, and he answered, "Hello." Static filled the line just like before. Then, clear and unmistakable, came his father's voice. "How's the new job working out, Bobby?" This time Robert was prepared for the shock, though his heart still raced. He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. It's good, Dad. Really good. I'm learning things about this city I never knew, even after all my years as a reporter. I'm proud of you, son. You're doing important work." The words filled Robert with a warmth he hadn't felt since childhood. Even as an adult, he'd craved his father's approval, and Frank Mitchell had been generous with his praise during Robert's journalism career. But this felt different, more personal, more significant. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "These calls. How is this possible? I mean, I know you died in 1984. I was there. I held your hand." A gentle chuckle came through the phone. "Some things don't need to be understood, Bobby. They just need to be accepted. What matters is that you're living again, really living. But I have so many questions about what it was like for you, about your experiences that I never asked about when you were alive." "Those are good questions, son. Important questions. But maybe they're not for me to answer anymore." Robert felt a sudden understanding wash over him. "You mean I should be asking other people those questions, the people I'm interviewing?" "Everyone has a story, Bobby. Everyone has experiences that shaped them, challenges they overcame, wisdom they gained. Your job isn't just to collect those stories. It's to help people understand that their lives mattered, that their experiences have value." The line crackled with static, and Robert sensed the conversation was coming to an end. "Wait," he said urgently. "Will you call again?" "When you need me to," came the reply, and then the line went dead. Robert sat staring at the phone for several minutes, processing what had just happened. The rational part of his mind continued to insist that these calls were impossible, perhaps hallucinations brought on by stress or grief, but the emotional impact was undeniable. Whether real or imagined, these conversations with his father were pushing him toward important realizations about his work and his life. He thought about Calvin Washington's story, about the courage it must have taken to be one of the first black police officers in Buffalo during such a turbulent time. He thought about Agnes Kowalski's journey from war-torn Poland to a new life in America, and about Mary Chen's determination to share her culture through food despite facing prejudice and misunderstanding. Each of these people had stories that deserved to be preserved, not just as historical records, but as testimonies to human resilience and courage. And Robert was in a unique position to ensure those stories were told properly, with the respect and attention they deserved. That evening, Robert called Linda Peterson at home, something he'd never done before. "Linda, I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said when she answered. "Not at all, Robert. What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about the scope of this project. We're documenting these incredible stories, but I wonder if we're thinking big enough about how to share them with the community." "What do you mean?" Robert took a deep breath, feeling the excitement of a new idea taking shape. What if we didn't just create an archive? What if we found ways to bring these stories to life for people? Public readings, maybe a podcast series, or partnerships with local schools to connect young people with these elder storytellers. Linda was quiet for a moment, and Robert worried he'd overstepped his role. "Robert," she finally said, "that's brilliant. I've been hoping someone would suggest expanding the project, but I wasn't sure how to approach it. Would you be interested in helping develop some of these ideas?" "Absolutely," Robert said, feeling more energized than he had in years. "I think there's something powerful about intergenerational connection, about helping young people understand that the elderly aren't just repositories of the past, they're bridges to understanding how we got to where we are today." And as they talked through possibilities for expanding the Community Voice project, Robert felt a sense of purpose that went beyond simply recording interviews. He was beginning to see his role not just as a collector of stories, but as a facilitator of connections between past and present, between different generations, between individual experiences and universal truths. After hanging up with Linda, Robert returned to his transcription work with renewed energy. Calvin Washington's words seemed to carry new weight. History gets written by whoever bothers to write it down. Robert was determined to write it down, all of it, and to find ways to ensure these voices from the past could speak to the present and future. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Whether his father's voice on the phone was real or a manifestation of his own subconscious wisdom didn't matter anymore. The message was clear. Everyone's story mattered, and Robert had found his purpose in helping those stories be heard. 2 months into the Community Voice project, Robert had become a different man. The work had given him structure, purpose, and a sense of connection to his community that he hadn't felt in years. He'd lost 15 pounds, started taking evening walks around his neighborhood, and had even begun cooking real meals for himself instead of subsisting on frozen dinners and takeout. The project had also grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. What had started as a simple oral history archive was now a multifaceted program that included a weekly podcast, monthly community storytelling events, and partnerships with 3 local schools where elderly residents shared their experiences with students studying Buffalo history. Robert had just finished his most powerful interview yet with Maria Santos, an 81-year-old woman who had fled Cuba in 1962 with nothing but the clothes on her back and her 2 young children. Her story of building a new life in Buffalo, learning English while working 3 jobs, and eventually opening a successful bakery that became a neighborhood institution, had left Robert emotionally drained but deeply inspired. It was while he was transcribing Maria's interview that evening that he noticed something odd. As he listened to her describe her first winter in Buffalo, she mentioned seeking help from a Catholic charity organization. "There was this man there, Franco," she said on the recording. "Franco Mitchell, I think his name was. He helped us get winter coats for the children, found us a better apartment. He was so kind, had this Brooklyn accent. He'd always call people by nicknames. He called me Maria Bella and my son Little Tony, even though his name was Antonio. Robert stopped the recording and played the section again. Franco Mitchell. His father's name had been Frank, but he'd sometimes gone by Franco in certain circles, particularly among the Italian and Hispanic families in their old Brooklyn neighborhood, and the detail about nicknames was spot on. Frank Mitchell had indeed called everyone by affectionate diminutives, but this didn't make sense. According to Maria's timeline, this would have been 1962 or 1963, when Robert's father was still living in Brooklyn and working at his auto repair shop. Robert had no memory of his father being involved with Catholic charities, and certainly not in Buffalo. Intrigued, Robert began looking back through his other interviews, searching for any other mentions of his father's name. What he found astonished him. Agnes Kowalski had mentioned a mechanic named Frank who had helped her husband find work in the 1950s. Nice man, this Frank Mitchell. Fixed our car for free when we first arrived. Said we needed all the help we could get starting fresh. Calvin Washington had referred to a Frank Mitchell who had testified as a character witness for a young black man wrongly accused of theft in the early 1970s. He didn't have to get involved, but Frank said he'd seen enough injustice for one lifetime. In interview after interview, Robert found subtle references to his father, sometimes just a first name, sometimes the full name, always described as someone who had helped during difficult times. The picture that emerged was of a man who had quietly made a difference in many lives, someone who had reached out to help newcomers and those facing challenges. Robert sat in his apartment that night, surrounded by printed transcripts and handwritten notes, trying to piece together this unexpected puzzle. His father had never mentioned any of these people or these acts of kindness. In fact, Frank Mitchell had always been somewhat secretive about his activities outside of work and family, often disappearing on weekend afternoons with vague explanations about errands or helping a friend. The phone rang at exactly midnight. This time, Robert didn't hesitate to answer. "Dad?" "Hello, Bobby. I see you've been doing some detective work." Robert's voice was steadier now, though his heart still raced at the sound of his father's voice. "Dad, I found your name in several of my interviews. These people remember you helping them, but you never told me about any of it." A warm chuckle came through the line. "Your old man had his secrets, I suppose, but they weren't really secrets, just things I didn't think needed talking about. Maria Santos said you helped her family when they came from Cuba. Agnes mentioned you fixing their car for free. Calvin said you testified for someone you barely knew." Robert's voice grew stronger with each example. "Why didn't you ever tell me about these things? Would it have changed anything if I had?" Frank's voice was gentle, but probing. "Would knowing about them have made you a better person, a better journalist, a better son?" Robert considered the question carefully. "Maybe. It might have helped me understand you better. It might have shown me different ways to help people. Or it might have made you think less of the help because it wasn't dramatic enough, wasn't newsworthy enough for a reporter's standards." The voice paused. "The best help usually isn't newsworthy, Bobby. It's quiet, personal, done without expecting recognition. But why are these people remembering you now, after all these years?" "Because," Frank said, "you're finally ready to hear their stories. And maybe you're finally ready to understand that the most important stories aren't always the ones that make headlines." Robert felt a sudden clarity wash over him. "This isn't really about you, is it? These phone calls, they're about me learning something." "What do you think you're learning?" Robert looked around his apartment, at the transcripts scattered across his coffee table, at the evidence of his father's quiet kindness that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. I'm learning that everyone has stories worth telling, that help doesn't have to be grand gestures to matter, that people remember kindness long after they forget everything else. And I'm learning that it's never too late to start making a difference, even in small ways. The line was quiet for a moment, filled only with the gentle static that had become familiar. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are these calls real? Another pause, longer this time. Does it matter, son? Whether I'm calling from somewhere beyond, or whether I'm just a voice in your head that sounds like your old man? Does it change what you've learned? Robert considered this carefully. The rational part of his mind had always insisted these calls were impossible. But the emotional truth they carried, the wisdom they offered, the push toward positive change they provided, those were undeniably real. No, he said finally, it doesn't change anything. The message is still true either way. Then maybe that's the only answer you need. Will I still hear from you? You'll hear from me whenever you need to, Bobby. But I think you're going to find that you need to less and less. You're remembering how to live again, how to connect with people, how to matter. That's all your old man ever wanted for you. Robert felt tears forming in his eyes. I miss you, Dad. I miss having you to talk to. I'm not really gone, son. Every time you help someone the way I helped those folks you've been interviewing, every time you listen to someone's story and make them feel like their life matters, every time you choose connection over isolation, I'm right there with you. The static grew louder, and Robert sensed this conversation might be their last. Dad, wait. I want you to know. The work I'm doing, the people I'm meeting, it's changing everything. I feel alive again. I know, Bobby. I'm proud of you. Your mother would be proud too. Tell her, Robert began, but the line had already gone dead. He sat holding the phone for a long time, understanding finally that he might never hear his father's voice again. But for the first time, that thought didn't fill him with sadness. Instead, he felt grateful for the conversations they'd had, for the push toward a new life, and for the realization that his father's influence had never really ended. The next morning, Robert called Linda Peterson with a proposal. Linda, I want to expand the project again. I've been thinking about all the connections between these stories, all the ways people helped each other over the years. What if we created a component focused on acts of kindness, small acts that people remember decades later? That's a beautiful idea, Robert. What made you think of it? Robert smiled, looking out his apartment window at the Buffalo street where his new life was taking shape. Someone reminded me that the best stories aren't always the biggest ones. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, the ones about people who helped without expecting recognition. Over the following weeks, Robert threw himself into this new direction with enthusiasm. He reached out to previous interviewees, asking them about moments of unexpected kindness they'd experienced or witnessed. The stories that emerged painted a picture of Buffalo as a community where people looked out for each other, where small gestures created ripple effects that lasted for generations. He also began volunteering at the community center beyond his interview duties. He helped serve meals, assisted with computer classes for seniors, and even started a weekly discussion group where residents could share current stories, not just historical ones. One evening, as Robert was leaving the center after a particularly engaging discussion group, he encountered a young man struggling to help his elderly grandfather navigate the front steps. Without thinking, Robert moved to assist, taking the older man's other arm and helping him safely down the stairs. "Thank you so much," the young man said. "I'm David, and this is my grandfather, Mr. Chen." Robert looked more closely at the elderly man and realized it was Henry Chen, Mary Chen's husband. Mary was the restaurant owner he'd interviewed weeks earlier. "Mr. Chen, it's good to see you again. I interviewed your wife about her restaurant." Henry Chen's face lit up with recognition. "You're the story man. Mary loved talking with you. She said you really listened, made her feel important." As they chatted, David explained that he'd been bringing his grandfather to the center's exercise programs to help with his mobility after a recent fall. "You know," Robert said, "I've been thinking about starting an intergenerational storytelling program here. Maybe some of the young people in the neighborhood would be interested in hearing stories from folks like your grandfather, and maybe some of the older residents would enjoy sharing their experiences with a younger audience." David's eyes lit up. "I'd love to be part of something like that. Grandpa has amazing stories, but I'm usually too busy to really sit and listen the way I should." As Robert walked home that evening, he reflected on how naturally the conversation had flowed, how easily the opportunity for connection had presented itself. This was what his father had been trying to tell him, that meaningful interactions happened when you were open to them, when you were engaged with the world around you rather than isolated from it. 3 months later, the Community Voice Project had become one of Buffalo's most celebrated community programs. Robert had been featured in the Buffalo News, his old newspaper, for his innovative approach to preserving local history. The intergenerational storytelling sessions he'd developed were drawing participants from across the city, creating connections between people who might never have met otherwise. But more importantly, Robert had rediscovered his sense of purpose. He woke each morning with things to do, people to see, stories to collect and share. His daughter Sarah had visited for the first time since her mother's funeral, and she'd been amazed by the transformation in her father. "Dad, you seem like yourself again," she'd said. "Actually, you seem like a better version of yourself." Robert knew she was right. The work had changed him, but so had the process of engaging with his community, of seeing himself as part of something larger than his own grief and isolation. On a quiet Sunday evening in December, as snow fell gently outside his apartment windows, Robert sat reviewing transcripts from his latest interviews. The project had now documented over 50 stories, creating a rich tapestry of Buffalo's recent history told through the voices of people who had lived it. His phone sat silent on the table beside him. He hadn't received any more midnight calls since that final conversation with his father, but he no longer felt like he needed them. The voice he needed to hear most clearly now was his own, telling him that his life still had purpose, that his story was still being written. As he worked, Robert thought about the lesson his father had been trying to teach him through those impossible phone calls. Whether they had been real visitations from beyond or products of his own subconscious wisdom didn't matter. What mattered was that they had pushed him toward a truth he'd lost sight of in his grief, that everyone's story mattered, that connection was always possible, and that it was never too late to start making a difference in the world. Robert Mitchell had answered the phone when it rang at midnight, and in doing so he had answered a call to a new kind of life, a life where his father's legacy of quiet kindness lived on through his own actions, where stories preserved the past while creating bridges to the future, and where a 63-year-old man had discovered that his most important chapters were still being written. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Buffalo in fresh whiteness. But inside Robert's apartment, warmed by purpose and connection, he worked on, knowing that tomorrow would bring new stories, new connections, and new opportunities to make a difference in the quiet, powerful ways that mattered most. The phone never rang at midnight again, but Robert had learned to listen for other calls, the voices of his community, the whispers of history, and the steady, reassuring voice of his own renewed purpose. Those calls came every day, and every day he answered.